it is possible to find cities without walls, without ladders, without kings, without wealth, but a city without a temple or that practiced not worship, prayers, and the like, no one ever saw.
A number of tribes were actually said to be without religion or godless throughout the centuries, I suppose, since atheism started to get a hold and stuff. Every single accusation has been overturned, and
Wow.
overturned quite easily.
Would a group of children raised in isolation spontaneously create their own religious belief? And this is interesting what Paul Bloom says, and I'm quote, I think the answer is yes, says developmental psychologist Paul Bloom. Now it gets more interesting, okay? If a generation of children were raised by robots that imparted no religious belief, will they spontaneously develop religion? And to this Paul Bloom answer, I think to some extent the answer has to be yes.
Bingo.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today we have none other than our very own Gerry Coghlan coming back to our channel. And we are going to be discussing about something very, very interesting, which is the spiritual religious instinct of human beings, the primordial state of human beings, or you can also call it the naturalness of belief, or the default factory setting of human beings, or the default position, which is the fitrah, the concept of fitrah in Islam. And inshallah, we are going to be putting forth some arguments for the fitrah, what the fitrah is, the implications, and also discussing how actually the fitrah refutes atheism. Our brother Gerry, our beloved brother, is going to be tackling this issue and making like putting forth some arguments for the fitrah via going back to the past, looking at the primitive and primary cultures and what they used to believe, and also dismantling some of the atheistic objections related to that. And inshallah, I'm going to be tackling this issue with a growing body of research concerning the fitrah and how it is a very good argument to prove God's existence in some sense. Or maybe it actually states that we don't even require evidence for God's existence because it is a self-evident truth. So let's start. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
Assalamu alaikum, brother Khalid.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you doing?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, all good, bro. You?
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, so as you said, today's video will be centered around some aspects of the fitrah, which Islam teaches us are true and real, and how they come true historically via reports of missionaries and explorers and anthropologists who are analyzing or living with and dealing with various different cultures around the world. The video will be focused on this, but I will certainly mention some names and some concepts which we don't have time to expand on right now, but which I went into detail on in the first video on this very channel. So if anyone hasn't watched, please go back and watch that one first, inshallah. It's not essential, but it will help you here and there to understand some of the things I speak about. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, inshallah, we will link the our previous video, inshallah, in the description. So anyone who's watching, they can find it in the description box.
Excellent.
Coming to the fitrah, introduction. Okay, so fitrah is an Arabic word used in Islamic theology to refer to the natural constitution of human beings, i.e., the pure and pristine original state upon which God creates all human beings. The human's natural state encompasses an inclination towards that which is moral and spiritual, pure, upright, and wholesome. The fitrah or innate nature encompasses our innate knowledge of inclinations on compassion, justice, morality, God, purpose, spirituality, language, and numbers too. So many people, they think that when we speak about the fitrah, it is just related to belief of God, but it's much more than that. It's not just God, but our spiritual instinct, of how we have inclinations towards being moral, to be compassionate, and many other things. Many of the intuitions that we have are actually encompassed within this concept of fitrah. We are born with this, and a very good working definition for the fitrah would be the original normative disposition. Can you add to that?
No, that's pretty much the definition I would have given myself. Like obviously, as you said, most people when they hear the word Fitrah, they would think it just gives us inclination or an instinct to know God exists, which it does. But it's also there are more branches to it. Like it gives you innate knowing that God is one as well. God is unique. It gives you a longing for God. It enables you to recognize creative agency in all the aspects of creation, including ourselves. That's, of course, if the fitrah is in proper working order or some way close to it, because we know that sin, especially repeated sin, and the more grave the sin gets, then the condition of the qalb, the heart, and the fitrah and our general internal state becomes like out of line, so to speak. But you can bring it back. But the obviously most pure example of the fitrah would be a child, as per the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He says that every child is born upon the fitrah, and then their parents make them Christian, Jew, Magian, or X, Y, Z. So today, I just want to bring up some quotes and some dialogues between missionaries, explorers, anthropologists, with various tribes people, or people from different cultures around the world, which highlight some of the aspects that Islam tells us are a part of our fitrah, such as recognizing creative agency in things like trees, rivers, the ecosystem, ourselves, analogy between how we make or how we build and how we create, and how there must be a builder, creator, designer, maker for the aspects of nature that the people seen. One other aspect of the fitrah that the Quran highlights is that when people are in real trouble, as the Quran says, when they're on a boat and the waves are washing over them, they feel real fear. Even those who worship many idols, many gods, or many objects of worship, they instinctively abandon all but the one true God, the worship of all but the one true God. And it says the dua becomes sincere to Him alone at that time. So I have a couple of examples of this. There are many more, but as I said in the previous video, just multiplying the same examples of one thing is not very fruitful. And I have some accusations of atheism or godlessness laid against some tribes, which were later overturned, and some aspects of the fitrah highlighted from them as well.
Inshallah. So I had I have one thing to add to that, which is this default if you can call fitrah as this default factory setting, which all human beings are delivered. The Quran presents the most fundamental aspect of the fitrah to be the spiritual inclinations towards God. So of course the fitrah can be a branch of many things, but the most fundamental aspect of the fitrah to be the spiritual inclination towards God, expressing one's love of God in prayer and gratitude, and striving to come closer to God. In addition, the moral inclination towards caring for others and doing good is also a part of the primordial state, as I mentioned earlier.
Yes, definitely.
So, should we start?
Yes, we can start. So to begin with, my reference here is a book called The History of Greenland. It's a very old book. It's from 1765, and it's written by a man called David Krantz, who was a German missionary to Greenland. Now, obviously, as languages change and evolve over time, a couple of, 200 and odd something years, this was written in old style German and translated into old style English. So some of the words may seem a bit off, but that's why. But it's basically a dialogue between him and one Greenlander. And before the dialogue, he writes about some of his experiences in Greenland as well. Just to give you the backdrop of it, before him and his missionary team got there, some sailors went there, some seamen, and they spent a bit of time in Greenland, and they drew some incorrect conclusions about the Greenlanders and their religion. So I'll start from there. This is quoting from his book now. So he says, before missionaries came into the country, the Greenlanders were reported to be such gross idolaters as to worship the sun, sacrificed to the devil, seeking aid from him, or at least that he not hinder their hunting and fishing. This the seamen, so not missionaries, seamen, did not learn from any discourse of the Greenlanders, for they understood nothing of what they said, but they drew the conclusion from certain circumstance. They saw that as soon as the Greenlanders arose in the morning, they went and stood with their faces towards the rising sun, in deep meditation, in order to discover by the look of the hemisphere, or by the motion of the clouds, whether they had good or bad weather to expect, or even a storm. They do so still every morning. The sailors, not knowing the true reason, believed they worshipped the sun. Again, others saw on some forsaken places many pots laid over with stone, and upon one elevated stone found some cinders, near it a heap of bare bones. The conclusion was directly made that the Greenlanders must have sacrificed here, and to whom could they have sacrificed but the devil? But the seamen had never seen the summer habitations of the Greenlanders, which are tents pitched in much quadrangular places, where they dress their meat with wood. Thus many people err in their conclusions concerning the constitution and religion of others, if they have only seen some circumstance without understanding them. And this is one of the reasons I pointed people back to the first video, because a lot of these accusations of atheism or being without religion came from people who stayed only hastily with a certain people, and like the missionary said, they didn't learn their language, didn't befriend them, etc., etc. So now he's speaking from himself again. The Greenlanders have neither a religion nor idolatrous worship, nor so much as any ceremonies to be perceived tending towards it. Hence, the first missionaries even entertained a supposition that there was not the least trace to be found among them of any conception of a divine being, especially as they had no word to express him by. Now, this, I have to highlight, this part of the dialogue is taking place also between missionaries who didn't have much of a grasp of the language. It gets clearer as we go along. When they were asked who made the heaven and the earth and all visible things, their answers were something like, "We know not," or "We do not know him," or "It must have been some mighty person," or "Things have always been as they are and will always remain so." But when they came to understand their language better, they found quite the reverse to be true. From the notions that the Greenlanders had, though vague and various, concerning the fowl and concerning spirits, and also their anxious worries about the fate after death. And not only so, but they could plainly gather from a free dialogue they had with some wild Greenlanders. This is where it gets connected to original monotheism. They plainly gathered from a free dialogue they had with some wild Greenlanders that their ancestors must have believed in a, as in singular, supreme being, and did render him some service, which their posterity, means succeeding generations, neglected little by little, and further they were removed from more wise and civilized nations, heading towards the ice plains, towards the middle of nowhere, until at last they lost every just or fair conception of the deity. Yet, after all, it is manifest that a faint idea of a divine being lies concealed even in the minds of these people, because they directly assent without any objection to the doctrine of a God and his attributes, meaning they accept it very easily without putting up a fight when they hear about it, except they are afraid of the consequences of this truth and so will not believe it. Then he says some not very nice things in the language which would have been par for the course a couple of 100 years ago, but it would be nice to say them now about the Greenlanders, so I'll just skip over that. But still further, some of them, though perhaps not all, must have had some meditations and inquiries in their mind concerning this matter before they saw any missionary, at least in their younger years, before family cares were accumulated upon them. This is plain from the following anecdote. So now he goes to a specific conversation between one Greenlander Eskimo and one of the missionaries. So this is after they had become Christian. So
Okay.
a missionary, being once in the company of some baptized Greenlanders, expressed his wonder how they could formerly have led such a senseless life, void of all reflection. Upon this, one of them answered him as follows: "It is true we were ignorant heathens, and knew nothing of a God or a Saviour, and indeed who would tell us of him until you came? But thou must not imagine that no Greenlander thinks about these things. I myself have often thought a kayak, which is one of their styles of boats, a kayak with all its tackle and implements does not grow into existence of itself, but must be made by the labour and ingenuity of man, and one that does not understand it would directly spoil it. Now, the meanest bird, meaning the least of the birds, has far more skill displayed in its structure than the best kayak, and no man can make a bird. But there is still far greater art shown in the formation of a man than of any other creature. Who was it that made him? I first thought he proceeded from his parents, and they from their parents. But some must have been the first parents. From where did they come? Common report informs me, meaning the common report of his people, they grew out of the earth. But if that is true, why does it not still happen that men grow out of the earth? And from where did the same earth itself, the sea, the sun, the moon, and the stars arise into existence? Certainly there must be some being who made all these things, a being that always was and can never cease to be. He must be inexpressibly more mighty, knowing, and wise than the wisest man. He must be very good too, because everything that he has made is good, useful, and necessary for us. Ah, did I but know him, how I would love and honour him. But who has seen him? Who has ever conversed with him? None of us poor men. Yet there may be men too that know something of him. Oh, could I but speak with such men! Therefore, as soon as I ever heard you speak of this great being, I believed it directly with all my heart because I had long desired to hear it. So that's the end of that dialogue, and there's just a little bit to
Wow.
add on now. This testimony was confirmed by the others with more or fewer attendant circumstances, meaning slightly different. As for instance, they added, a man is quite different from the beasts. The beasts have no understanding, but they serve for food to each other and all for the use of man. But man has an intelligent soul, is subject to no creature in the world, and yet man is afraid of his future fate. What is it that he is afraid of there? There must be a great spirit that has dominion over us. Oh, did we but know him? Oh, had we but him for our friend. So you have
Wow.
clear inference there from the natural world, the phenomenon that the Eskimos saw. His analogy with him making the kayaks, their style of boat, and how they can never make anything even approaching a bird, uh, working out some of the attributes that God must have, and then actually a desire in his heart to know God or to connect with God. And it wasn't just one of them, it was quite a few of them because it was confirmed by others. But unfortunately, or as Allah willed, the Christians got there first. But you heard what the missionaries said. They assent to the doctrine of a God and his attributes with no resistance. So they would have been primed for Islam, these people, you know. There
Right.
you go.
So the first thing to note is that I believe that even though they were not in contact with any other, like culture, tribe, etc.,
Yeah.
but they had this natural longing to know God, a natural longing to connect with the transcendent, to know
Yeah.
more about God, and they still inferred things like the God would be good, he's the creator, he's there should be a spirit, like this is something worth, like noting. Not just that, but they are also making arguments for design, like from
Yes,
design,
exactly.
that they might be a designer. So I think this kind of well affirms, like that you don't need cultural influence to come to the, like come to the conclusion of a belief in a God, as we've already mentioned. And inshallah, like as you are mentioning these testimonies of the past, what I would be doing is, like I would try to put forth, like some kind of contemporary research in academia, which kind of correlates with these kind of testimonies, inshallah ta'ala. So while the concept of the inherent human disposition has been discussed in Islamic theology for centuries, many of its implications are remarkably being elaborated by contemporary research. From childhood psychologists, cognitive scientists, ethicists, anthropologists, and linguists, I'm going to be referring them as some suggestive evidence. So, of course, one thing to note is that, like we don't need evidence for God, because God is self-evidently true.
Mm.
It is a basic belief. But at the same, even though we can make arguments for God, atheists might say that like they're not making any arguments for God. So, inshallah, on our channel, we can, like have, inshallah, soon we'll have more discussions on this, where we will make rational arguments for God. But the point is, what we are going to focus, inshallah, on this video is that we don't need to provide evidence of God, because it is a self-evident. It's a self-evident belief. It's a basic belief. It's an axiomatic belief. So, modern cognitive science has also asserted that belief in God does not arise from extensive philosophical deliberations, inferences, or other rational processes, even though they can, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
But through a separate primary God faculty. This is beyond the reach of reason. Kelly Clark, a philosopher who writes extensively on the cognitive science of religion, states that the belief in God is a natural product of our common cognitive faculties, and in the sense, religious belief is natural, as mentioned. Now, this is going to be interesting, inshallah. And we'll start with Paul Bloom. Paul Bloom is basically an atheist, an agnostic atheist. And he states that when children are directly asked about the origin of animal and people, they tend to prefer explanations that involve an intentional creator, even if the adults who raise them do not. So why would they do that? Look, so this is interesting, that this kind of shows that there is something that inclines human beings towards these kind of explanations. And another quote is from Justin Barrett. Justin Barrett is another cognitive scientist, very popular one. He says that the tendency to see function and purpose, plus an understanding that purpose and order comes from minded beings, makes children likely to see natural phenomena and intentionally as intentionally created. Who is the creator? Children know people are not good candidates. It must have been a god. And then for more psychological evidence, we have Olivera Petrovich, who's also an Oxford researcher. And for the topic, belief in a supernatural designer or cause is based on the natural functioning of the human psyche. So the academic Olivera Petrovich conducted research concerning the origins of natural things such as plants and animals, and she found that preschoolers were about 7 times more likely to say God created them rather than humans. In her popular interview, Petrovich concluded that the belief in a non-anthropomorphic God seems to be natural, and that atheism is an acquired cognitive position. Petrovich has published a book called Natural Theological Understanding from Childhood to Adulthood that elaborates further on this issue. So, inshallah, I'm going to be linking whatever I'm referencing on the screen, so anyone who's watching, they can read all the references.
Sure.
Now, let's move on to the biggest research ever done on this topic. So, inshallah, I'm going to be attaching the research too. The new research finds that human beings, okay, it's not new, it might be, I guess, 2012, but I'm just quoting it directly. So, new research finds that human beings have natural tendencies to believe in gods and afterlife also. So, this is interesting that this is not just God, but afterlife. Research suggests that people across many different cultures instinctively believe that some part of their mind, soul, or spirit lives on after death. The studies demonstrate that people are natural dualist as in believing in the body and the mind, and these are two different things, like the soul and the mind. Finding it easy to conceive of the separation of the body and the mind. Now, I'm not going to go so deep into it. Anyone who's interested, I'll give the references, they can read that. You have anything to add? Because I have 4 or 5 more interesting stuff to add.
Yeah, just to connect it to what the missionary said about the Greenlanders, you notice that the Greenlander didn't just stop at inferring from the natural world around him that there must be a creator. Both of them, or more than one of them, mentioned that they actually had fear of what was going to happen after death. So it's interesting that the studies say that the belief in God is innate as well, and the belief in the afterlife, and the missionary also said that it tends to be stronger in people who are younger before they get burdened down with family and responsibilities and stuff like this. So it all kind of ties in nicely,
Wow. And that reminds me of a very interesting topic, which is if you follow some atheists who who kind of have YouTube channels, and some of them are really honest, and they admit themselves that even though I've got rid of the belief in God, I still have this kind of a fear of hell. So why do you have that fear of hell?
Yeah.
One very interesting admission was from Cosmic Skeptic, who's a popular atheist YouTuber. He admits that I was still left with this feeling that he used to say that there was some kind of a blip that if I'm traveling in a bus, and I'm trying to paraphrase what he said, is that, I used to feel within myself like, oh, I'm going to hell, and like, and then you like, then my rationality comes in and you tries to suppress that in some sense. So
It
that is quite
reminds
interesting.
me, just quickly, it reminds me of one conversation I had in Street Dawa years ago with a young American, and I asked if you believe in God, and the answer wasn't a yes or a no, but the person was raised in a Christian family, and their response was, I cannot shake the belief. So they didn't say they believe or they didn't disbelieve, but obviously they didn't want to believe, because otherwise why would they say that? They literally said, I cannot shake or I cannot get rid of this belief. So it does, you can do mental acrobatics to convince yourself of X, Y, and Z argument against God or atheism, but there's always going to be something internally pushing you, or trying to fight with these rationalizations.
I have just one more thing to add, actually two, which is in Justin Barrett's book Born Believers. There is one thing very interesting he mentioned. He quotes someone like, he what he came across, which is that, a lady, I think, it's her testimony. She says that I am Christian, but my husband is an atheist. So we agreed not to push our kids in either direction, but it doesn't seem to matter. All three girls believe in God, and not just a bit. Sophie, my oldest, has rose with her dad and tells him he's wrong about God not existing. Subhanallah.
Nice. Man.
So, anything you would like to add?
No. Shall we go to the next quote?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this one is some way similar to the references from the Greenlanders, except it's from a member of the Oglala Sao tribe, which is one of the branches of the Sao tribe from South Dakota in the Midwest US. And the anthropologist who had the dialogue or reported the dialogue is called Frances Theresa Densmore. She's known for deep studies of Native American music, culture, art, and all aspects of Native American life. It's a really, really long dialogue, and I've just had to cut bits and pieces out of it. The guy philosophizes about everything the native, But these particular branch of the Saos, they called God Wakantanka. Again, like I said in the previous video, these people were mushrikun, without a doubt. We're not saying that they were Muslim or anything, but they did believe in one supreme being over and above all the other lesser gods. But they did say Wakantanka had 16 aspects. Some of these aspects are abstract concepts and some are like physical phenomena. It's quite a strange belief, but the point is not to go into their belief. It's like how he attributes the wisdom of what he sees in creation to the supreme God, and a little bit of his experience when he was younger and he was really thinking about things that he could see and such. So he says, all living creatures and plants derive their life from the sun. If it were not for the sun, there would be darkness, nothing could grow. The earth would be lifeless, yet the sun must have the help of the earth. If the sun alone were to act upon animals and plants, the heat would be so great they would die. But the clouds bring rain, and the action of the sun and the earth together supply the moisture needed for life. The roots of a plant go down, and the deeper they go, the more moisture they find. This is according to the laws of nature, and is one of the evidences of the wisdom of Wakantanka. Plants are sent by Wakantanka and come from the ground at his command. The part to be affected by the sun and rain appearing above ground, and the roots pressing downward to find the moisture which is supplied for them. Animals and plants are taught by Wakantanka what they are to do. So he attributes the instinctive knowing of animals and plants even to guidance from God, which is actually correct, even though his conception of God is off. So Wakantanka teaches the birds to make nests, yet the nests of all birds are not alike. Wakantanka gives them the outline. Some make better nests than others, In the same way, some animals are satisfied with rough dwellings, while others have more attractive places to live. The forest is the home of many birds and other animals, and the water is the home of fish and reptiles. All birds, even those of the same species, are not alike, and it is the same with animals and with human beings. The reason Wakantanka does not make two birds or animals or humans exactly alike is because each is placed here by Wakantanka to be an independent individuality and to rely upon itself. Now he goes on to speak in the same manner about leaves, trees, grasses, and more about the birds and so on and so forth. But he's basically attributing the purposefulness and the wisdom and the utility in creation to God, basically. And then he says, he gets a bit more fittery now. He says, all classes of people know that when human power fails, they must look to a higher power for the fulfillment of their desires. There are many ways in which the request for help from the higher power can be made. It depends on the individual. Some like to be quiet, and others want to do everything in public. Some like to go alone, away from the crowd, to meditate upon many things. In order to secure the fulfillment of his desire, a man must qualify to make his request. Lack of preparation would mean failure to secure a response to his petition. Then he goes on and speaks more about their methods of dua and whatnot. But he takes the dialogue back to when he was 10, and obviously we believe Fitrah is stronger the younger the person is. So he says, much like the Greenlander in the last example, he said, when I was 10 years of age, I looked at the land and the rivers, the sky above, and the animals around me, and could not fail to realize they were made by some great power. In other words, he was just certain of it. I was so anxious to understand this power that I questioned the trees and the bushes. So again, it's not just realization that there is God or there is a creator. He wanted to know God as well. So it seemed as though the flowers were staring at me, and I wanted to ask them, who made you? I looked at the moss covered stones. Some of them seemed to have the features of a man, but they could not answer me. Then I had a dream, and in my dream, one of these small round stones appeared to me and told me that the maker of everything was Wakantanka, and that in order to honor him, I must honor his works in nature. And the stone said that by my search I had shown myself worthy of supernatural help. And then he goes and talks about some strange rituals that him and his people do with the stones for cures and stuff. Basically, they take them as intercessors with Wakantanka, or with the supreme god of his tribe. And like I said, they were just some excerpts from a really, really long dialogue where he talks about everything you can think of. But some parts he gets quite philosophical. But again, it shows that you don't really need anything to come to the conclusion that God exists in terms of abstract arguments or rational proofs. Like people, tribesmen all the world over, have been concluding it just from the natural environment around them, And it's quite curious that he says when he was 10, this this epiphany dawned on him, because this matches with the Islamic description of the fitrah as well.
Subhanallah. And if I'd like to add something to that, which is also I would recommend, like in academy, there's Deborah Kellyman and her works, also known as intuitive theist, with the topic. She argues that children have this innate perception of everything is purposeful, and someone has made them for a purpose. Also, works of Deborah Kellyman known as promiscuous teleology. This kind of explains, in some sense, this topic where this is also another aspect of the fitrah, to find purpose and have this notion that everything is purposeful in some sense, even though they cannot derive what the clear purpose is, but then they know that there is some purpose behind the rocks being pointing. Children automatically see the natural world as designed and purposeful. They also sense that the designer of the world is God. It is a secular materialistic education that dulls these senses and turns the idea of God into a proposition that might be proven through scientific investigation. Without an indoctrination, the belief in God is an automatic and indubitable as the belief in the external world itself, or the belief in cause and effect.
Bingo.
So again, bingo for uh, providing more evidence to what we've already piled up. But inshallah, I think there is much more than this. So coming back to something very interesting, and I think this is going to be very interesting, and a problem for atheists to explain. Now coming to New Scientist, February 2009. Now this is interesting, where Michael Brooks, I think he was interviewing Paul Bloom, and he asked he asked this to Paul Bloom: would a group of children raised in isolation spontaneously create their own religious belief? And this is interesting what Paul Bloom says, and I'm quote: I think the answer is yes, says developmental psychologist Paul Bloom. So if people are born raised, would a group of children raised in isolation spontaneously create their own religious belief? So where this religious belief coming from? Moreover, psychologist Paul Bloom argues that the recent finding in cognitive psychology indicates that two key aspects of religious belief, belief in a designer and belief in mind-body dualism, are natural to young children. Again, another evidence piled up.
Yeah.
Now it gets more interesting. Okay, so this is from the Veritas Forum, and this was a very interesting discussion where Justin Barrett, I mentioned earlier, and Paul Bloom, they were together, and someone asked, and inshallah I will reference the link. Someone asked this question: if a generation of children were raised by robots that imparted no religious belief, will they spontaneously develop religion? And to this, Paul Bloom answer, I think to some extent the answer has to be yes. Subhanallah. So now, one more thing to add to that is humans are programmed to believe in God and afterlife. Now, this is again another atheist developmental psychologist. His name is Bruce Hood. Bruce Hood from Bristol University asserts that I am convinced that if we placed a group of infants on a desert island and allowed them to grow up without any culture, and I'm quoting him, they would sooner or later create some form of religion with gods, invisible powers, and even and an afterlife. It would most probably be similar to the religions of prehistoric societies. Now, of course, if we go deep into if our audiences watch the first video that we had, our discussion, I mean, we can unravel more of what prehistoric societies had, what beliefs they had, and what was the basic or the most oldest belief we had So again, covering this up, you have anything more to add to that?
No, I think you pretty much got it. Yeah.
So now I think I'll move on to the topic of the spiritual instinct, and I have an argument for an argument against atheism. So let's move on to the spiritual instinct of human beings, and I'm gonna quote some maybe philosophers, some theologians, and some people who have noticed this. One interesting article on Yaqeen, and I'm gonna quote a bit of that, which states that spirituality has been an internal part of the human condition throughout history and across civilization. In the modern period, despite prevailing attitudes of materialism, naturalism, and hedonism, the human need for spiritual expression persists, such as a strong universal desire suggests that human beings possess a spiritual instinct that inclines them towards the transcendent. Now there is this is another quote from I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm gonna just add that he says that if we traverse the world, it is possible to find cities without walls, without ladders, without kings, without wealth, but a city without a temple or that practiced not worship, prayers, and the like, no one ever saw.
100%.
And
Yeah. I
and
mean,
and one more thing which is very interesting is I was just a few days back I was reading this new book launched by our brother Yusuf Pontus on nihilism, and
mm,
within his book he is quoting Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is known as one of the most prominent atheists, and he had a discussion with Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan I think asked him, is there ever been an atheist civilization? And he simply says that no, there has something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing, that no, there has never been an atheist civilization ever, which is quite fascinating, which is quite interesting. And then also there is one philosopher known as Malik Banabi, and this is very interesting. Humans exist in a dual plane of reality that is comprised of the physical and metaphysical world. This is why, and now Malik says, people's custom and habits are moduled by a metaphysical preoccupation that inclines even the smallest village together around a small hut, deliberately and carefully built as a meeting place for spiritual devotions, varying in their primitiveness. So kind of not just our like it's not just that individually we believe about God, like we come to a belief, but we collectively also start believe in God. And every culture, like has something, like to connect with the transcendent, and it's sometimes in some sense in congregation also.
For sure.
Then Malik Banabi also mentions that human consciousness has thus faced throughout all the phases of its development that metaphysical problem with such regularities is itself an issue, which sociologists wish to resolve by characterizing man as a fundamentally religious animal. So, so this kind of separates human beings from animals, because we have this spiritual instinct, and there is not very good explanation as to why we have it in the first place. And inshallah we can move on to that topic later. But now, after making so many points, now this is an argument against atheism, and this is what I would like to put forward. Now this is known as this is from Malik Banabi, a lethal blow to naturalism. So Banabi argues that seeing spirituality as an instinct delivers a lethal blow to the worldview of naturalism, and by extension atheism. According to Banavi, if we conclude that the cross-cultural consistency of spiritual expression arises from an instinctive process, then we place the phenomena of religion at the level of cosmic facts together with natural laws. What he means to say is that so how do we humans know the world, like that, like for example, our basic beliefs in the law of non-contradiction, for example, that is how logic built, which is where we build on logic from. And from beliefs like other minds are real, our own, apart from our own, other minds are real, and the real world, the outside world is real in some sense. These are some very foundational beliefs, which is where we start off from. This is not something which we need evidence from. Rather, this is the metaphysics that we put on, we use to know the world. So if if our spiritual instinct is from that category, then it is further argued, therefore if we accept empirical and logical facts based on our instinctive capacity for sensory perception and our innate cognitive ability to reason, we must also accept the spiritual impulse that drives us to believe in the metaphysical unseen realm, gaib. He explains that religion appears to be appears to be inscribed in the order of the universe as a law characteristics of the human spirit. Now, this is something we've established, that okay, it's the spiritual instinct, which is in some sense within this category, which is something natural, intuitive, untaught, and cross-cultural or universal. Denying the legitimacy of our spiritual faculty would also question the validity of all the other processes of the mind, including sensory perception and reasoning, since they are derived from the same source. So this is interesting. Why is he saying that, and why would we argue with that? So, for example, if an atheist claims that okay, I'm going to deny this instinct of mine, but the instinct for reasoning I'm going to choose, and the instinct for example, sensory perception, I'm going to rely on that. So this is in some sense a double standard approach that the atheist is applying, which is not reasonable at all, because what standard do you have to choose reasoning and sensory perception as something of your foundation, and this foundation within the human being, you're trying to deny that? This would be in some sense like selective skepticism. You're selectively being skeptical about one aspect of your nature and not others. And many might put forth this objection that in some sense the reasoning abilities we have, we can justify them, but that is in some sense circular, because to even reason you actually need to have this perception of reasoning, which is kind of automatically delivered to you by your cognitive faculties. And I think the Justin Barrett take on this is very interesting. He says that when that if there are if there are beliefs that are automatically delivered to us by our cognitive system, they become the default position, and default position should not be negated unless you find evidence against it. So it's like, for example, in a court system, you are innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until proven innocent. The same way for our basic beliefs, they cannot be guilty until proven innocent. Like the atheists, they put forth that, prove God to me, only then I would believe. But that is again problematic, because God is the default position. So rather the question should be on the atheist. Why do you disbelieve in God? And they are the one who have the onus of proof, and not us. So if they are in some sense have applying this kind of selective skepticism, this shows that the reasoning is in some sense incoherent or inconsistent. And this is why a very good quote, which I go most of the time use, which is that it is not the lack of available evidence that makes one an atheist. Rather, it is the lack of coherence or lack of consistency in one's own reasoning. So if you have a lack of consistency or lack of coherence in your reasoning, then maybe atheism might be plausible for you. But if you are being true to yourself, then atheism can never be a justifiable position for you. So that's it for this particular topic. Now, please, if what are your views on this?
Um, just to add to the last of what you said, the position of atheism is chosen before the demands for evidence. Like rationality, scientific evidence, and proofs, and all this demands for proofs. These are just the veneer that the atheist puts over the foundation of unbelief that they've already chosen. Because if you look at the reasons why Allah says people do shirk and kufr in the Quran, they're always petty reasons. In Surah Yunus, Allah basically says that they don't want to meet Him, they don't hope to meet Him, they don't expect to meet Him. That leads them to being comfortable and satisfied with the life of this world. And in the same ayah, Allah then says they are heedless of His signs. So it's not that they don't have the signs, it's just that the previous two factors lead them to not acknowledging the signs. In Surah Ibrahim, I believe it's the fourth verse, somewhere near the beginning, Allah then also says that one aspect of those who disbelieve is that they want others to follow them. Like in English, we say misery loves company. Allah says that
Yeah,
you find people trying to avert from the way of Allah and call to the way of disbelief. Yeah, again, for a petty and emotional reason. And in Surah Qiyamah, Allah says you leave behind you the hereafter simply because you prefer the immediate. Like the desires and the shahwat, they're here and you can take them now, even though the hereafter is embedded in the hearts of the people and it's far better and more lasting. Like shirk is not based on having this proof or that proof. It's actually the opposite, because if you look at what Allah says disbelievers don't do, tadabbur, tafakkur, and ta'aqqul is use of intellect, deep pondering and reflection on creation as well. It's actually the other way around, like you say, the position is already chosen and these things are just the front that they pull over it.
exactly. Also, very interesting hadith that I would like to quote, and this is the hadith is like, from I guess Sahih Muslim, where Allah via Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam states that I created my servants in the right religion, but devils make them go astray. And if you are watching the representation, it would show that that the right religion is like the right path, the straight path, and devils, like they cause people or push people to go astray, which can be maybe like in this direction, which could be polytheism, this direction could be atheism. So but the right path, the Hanif, is what Islam is basically. uh, Also, inshallah, maybe in future I can add some references, because I think that would be too much for our audience. Is
Yeah, of course.
why atheism is mostly emotive and psychological and not rational. And there's a lot of evidence on that, and maybe we can touch on that. But again, one thing very interesting, which is not known, is or majorly not recognized, is atheism is also a form of shirk, and many Muslims, they don't understand. So like for example, a polytheist or worshipper of the past, they used to worship volcanoes, and they used to believe that this volcano provides, this volcano gives and nurtures, etc. Now what atheists are doing is, and what the volcano worshipper is doing, he is taking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes and attributing it to something finite. The same way what the atheist is doing is the atheist is taking attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and giving it to the universe in some sense. So what he might say that the universe is the creator, the universe is the sustainer, or maybe these laws are the sustainers. And this is a form of shirk. Again, now we don't recognize this, but yes, atheism is also a form of shirk, because those attributes belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not something some a trivial natural process or something like that.
Yeah, there's other pathways of shirk within atheism as well, but obviously
Yeah.
it's not the focus of this episode. But it is when you really break it down and you speak to them time and time again, you realize that they do actually have shirk. When you go deeper into conversation with them, it's just, it might not be so obvious as the guy who bows to an idol or the one who calls Jesus God, but they do have aspects of it without a doubt. And even their behavior, like the more I studied the mushrikun of the past and stuff, the more I can see that atheists are like just modern day mushrikun with a different veneer and different color of paint. But yeah, maybe for another episode, inshallah.
Inshallah. Also, there is one more interesting thing that I would like to add. It was from John Lennox, I believe. A very interesting quote. I hope I'm able to find it in time. Okay, I'll just add it in post production, inshallah. So, coming back to atheism, now this topic is also very interesting, which is now we're going to focus not on the natural state but rather on atheism itself, because that is something unnatural, of course. Atheism is cognitively effortful, and this is the topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first reference the most prominent, well-known atheist, which is Richard Dawkins, and I'm going to quote himself. And this was a very actually surprising, good debate between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins. So they were discussing on whether gods exist or not on this topic. And in some part of the video, Richard Dawkins admits, and he says that, I think that when you consider the beauty of the world and you wonder how it came to be what it is, you are naturally overwhelmed with a feeling of awe, a feeling of admiration, and you almost feel a desire to worship something. Then he says, I feel this. I recognize that other scientists such as Carl Sagan feel this. Einstein felt this. We all of us share a kind of religious reverence for the beauties of the universe, for the complexities of life, for the sheer magnitude of the cosmos. And then he says, it is tempting to translate that feeling of awe and worship into a desire to worship some particular thing, a person, an agent. You want to attribute it to a creator or a maker. So this is quite interesting. The most prominent atheist in the world, he is admitting that he feels this from within himself. He feels that he wants to worship something, looking at the beauties of the universe and the sheer magnitude of the cosmos. But then, what is he doing when he's not doing that? He's trying to suppress that in some sense. And there are various studies that actually prove that atheism is cognitively effortful. One of them I'm going to add, inshallah, and people can reference that. Then, what is more interesting? In the Science Journal of Nature, Washington University anthropologist Professor Pascal Boyer said, religious thinking seems to be the path of least resistance for our cognitive systems. So what he's saying is that the religious thinking seems to be the path of least resistance for our cognitive system. So it is very easy to be religious, but it's not going to be as easy to be, like, for example, an atheist. You have to put an effort. It is not something natural. So there was one hadith I remember. I think no, there is one verse in the Quran which kind of alludes to this, like, this idea, and that is, so the quote the quote from Quran is chapter 67 verse 22. Then is one who walks upside down on his face better guided, or the one who walks upright on a straight path? So the one, for example, who's walking unnaturally, not the way he's created, like, it's gonna be really effortful for him to do that. And on the contrary, a person walking naturally how it is he's supposed to walk is going to be something very easy for him. So the same way atheism is something like that, I believe, where it becomes really effortful. Now, our Pascal Boyer also says, by contrast, disbelief is generally the work of deliberate, effortful work, against our natural cognitive disposition. Hardly the easiest, hardly the easiest ideology to propagate. So he himself is claiming that it is very hard to even propagate atheism because it's going to be something very unnatural. Just
Of
like
course.
walking on your face, atheism is also something which is very unnatural. Now, in an interview, the Oxford researcher Dr. Olivera Petrovich states that uh, infants have natural belief in God, and she also admits that atheism is definitely an acquired position. Coming back to experimental psychologist Justin Barrett, in one of his lectures, he states that religious thought actually comes very natural to us. It doesn't require special kind of cultural conditions. If anything, it requires special cultural conditions to inhibit. So in some sense, you don't need special cultural conditions to believe in God, but special cultural conditions can actually be used to inhibit that. The playing field is tilted towards the religious beliefs and practices. Now one more, just to end it all. A recent study in psychology of disbelief concludes, and I'm going to reference the study. Therefore, atheism is possible but requires some hard cognitive work to reject or override the intuitions that nourish religious belief. Now, to sum it all up, what is interesting, that it is fascinating that the Quranic term for disbelief, kufr, literally carries the meaning of covering up and repressing by burying something. Now, if you see the root word kufr, and if you go what it means, it means, for example, a farmer trying to bury something, or try to hide the truth, in some sense, burying something in the ground. When we think about kufr in the context of religious instinct, we can understand it is a covering up of and repressing an instinctual drive, and this is what even studies in academia are kind of alluding towards. Anyway, now I think I took a lot of your time. Coming back to you,
That's
and
fine.
please go ahead.
Yeah, so one other aspect of the fitrah we mentioned, Allah refers to the mushrikun, like we said in the beginning, when they're under real stress and under heavy pressure that they wouldn't normally be in day-to-day life. Their dua becomes sincere, meaning they supplicate to Allah alone to get them out of the particular trouble they are in. Now, amongst the mushrikun, tribal societies and civilizational societies, something along these lines has been reported over and over and over again. That when they are in real trouble, the false objects of worship, they all get cast aside and swept under the carpet, and that they actually call upon God instinctively, as is installed in the Fitrah. And I don't want to bring like example after example. I've just got three quotes here. One is a general quote from a church father, which I'll go to now, and then two specific instances, one from China and one from Kenya.
So this is also linked to, if there's a very common quote which is there are no atheists in a foxhole.
Same thing, exact same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And even atheists have reported praying when they were in dire trouble as well, like in the modern era, obviously. So the first quote, the general quote, is from one of the early church fathers called Lactantius, and he wrote a book or a volume of books called the Divine Institutes. He was a convert from Roman paganism himself, along with Emperor Constantine. And he was his advisor. So he's talking about the worship of many gods or many beings. He says, and yet allowance might be made for this impiety of men, if their error proceeded altogether from ignorance of the divine name. But when we see the worshippers of the gods, plural, often confessing and proclaiming the supreme God, what pardon of their impiety can they expect, since they do not acknowledge the worship of him, of whom it is impossible man should be entirely ignorant? For when they swear or wish or give thanks, they do not name Jupiter nor many gods but God. Thus the truth, by the force of nature, i.e. Fitrah, breaks forth from their unwilling breasts. They do not indeed do the same in the midst of prosperity, meaning when times are good, they don't do this. Then chiefly God glides out of the memory of men. When enjoying his benefits, they ought to give honour to the divine goodness. But if any heavy necessity presses on them, Then they remember God. If the terror of war has raged, if pestilence has brooded over them, if long drought has denied their nourishment from the fruits of the earth, if a fierce tempest or storm of hail comes upon them, they fly to God. Assistance is sought from God. God is asked to come to their relief. If anyone be tossed by raging winds upon the sea, he calls on him. If anyone is tormented by violence, he implores him. If anyone is reduced to the necessity of beggary, his appeal is to God alone, and it is by his divine and only influence that he entreats men and has compassion upon them. Therefore they never remember God but when they are in misfortune. After the fear has left them and the dangers have receded, then with alacrity they run to the temples of the gods, plural. They pour out libations to them, they sacrifice to them, they crown them. Now this guy was roughly between 400 and 300 years before the revelation of the Quran, but he basically summed up the Fitrah aspect that we just spoke about. He's saying when men are in situations where they think they can lose their lives, so to speak, the idols are out the window, the jinn, the angels, the saints, the ancestors, they're all gone, and they call upon God alone. And he's talking about the mushrikun of his day in Rome, of course. So, and he was one of them, so he would have been more than familiar with their comings and goings, So I have a specific example of this from China. Now, the traditional Chinese name for God was Shangdi, which is a compound of two words. Shang means above or superior to, and Di means authority. But when you compound the word, it gives a very strong meaning. It's like the most high or the most superior authority. Malikul A'la, you could say in Arabic, or something along those lines. But the name disappears in later Chinese works, but it's extant and open in the earlier ones, which again supports monotheism being original. But this quote is from a book called the Shi Jing or Shi Qing, which is a very known book of poetry, sometimes called the Book of Songs, sometimes the Book of Odes. Has 305 works dating from the 11th to the 7th centuries BCE. Much of it is said to have been compiled by Confucius, but I don't know if that's verified or not. But it's studied and memorized by scholars in China and neighboring countries for the last 2 millennia. So keep in mind the situation is on the eve of a battle, and the Chinese did have a particular god of war, so you would think that before battle they would be praying to the god of war logically, But in the section entitled Great Brightness, we read the following address to King Wu. So King Wu was a king commanding a smaller force, and he was about to take on the emperor of the Yin dynasty, who was a tyrant, So on the eve of his engaging the forces that were supporting the tyrannical rule of the last emperor of the Yin dynasty, it was said his general saw him becoming nervous because King Wu was out there on the front line with his troops, And looking at the superior force, he started to become nervous, which is quite natural. And one of his generals said, the multitudes of Yin are gathered like the leaves of a forest, as they are spread out there in Mo Ye. But we are in good spirits, and Shangdi is with you. Therefore, banish all doubt from your mind. So the commentary expands on this. It says, when King Wu was attacking Chao, the forces of the latter were collected, numerous as the leaves of a forest, to withstand him, and pitched in the area called Mo Ye. Though Wu's forces were all in high spirits with their enterprise, they were afraid lest his mind, meaning their king's mind, should be in anxiety on account of the comparative small size of his army. Therefore they animated him by saying, Shangdi is with you, so banish all the hesitation from your mind. So they didn't appeal to the specific god of war that they had, they appealed to the name of God from the Chinese classics to settle the heart of the emperor or the king and give him courage when he was facing the greater force. And it's been, this phenomenon in China has been spoken about generally by many of the scholars who have analyzed early Chinese religious beliefs. And I have something similar here from a tribe in Kenya. Let me pull the reference. So this reference is from Jomo Kenyatta, who was writing in the Journal of the International African Institute. He's talking about an indigenous tribe called the Kikuyu, inhabitants of central Kenya. So they did believe in a high god called Engai, who was creator. They did not attribute any family to him, like this was one of the modes of shirk that happened, as we explained in the previous video. They did believe in some incarnations, like the Christians believe God incarnated in the Old Testament in the form of Jesus, and that the Supreme Being had certain bases on earth, but they also believed Engai was all powerful, not seen by human eyes. He is not the natural phenomena that we see, they are manifestations of his power. Their day to day worship was mainly focused on their ancestors. The term they use for the worship of the high god is Kothe Tahia. They never use this term when they worship the ancestors. So there's even a distinct word for the worship of the high god and the worship of the ancestors. Even the ancestors that they worship, they must also sacrifice and worship Engai, proving they are lower than the high god. So in the previous video, we also spoke about the remote god phenomenon, Deus Atheosis, where certain tribes retained their belief in the supreme god, but they didn't have an active cult of worshipping him, except, just like Lactantius, the Roman church father, said, when they're in situations of real trouble. So this scholar here says that Engai is called upon at times they would consider more important or stressful, such as drought or epidemics of disease. He is then not beseeched by an individual but by a clan head on behalf of the whole clan, and it is also specifically stated that prayers are not addressed to him during periods of ease or happiness. And again, this phenomenon was noted over and over, but there's no point to multiply examples of the same thing. But got one from Rome, one from China, one from Kenya there, and they're all pretty much saying the same thing, you know. So that's that aspect of the fitrah.
MashaAllah. So I think should we deal with some objections that atheists might come up with regarding
Yeah,
this?
yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I think one cliche would be that atheists would say that of course we are inclined towards religious belief because it's an evolutionary byproduct, maybe it is just adaptive. But then the issue is that when we are saying that this aspect of evolution, which is automatically delivered to us by our cognitive system, is adaptive, but then it should be negated and it's unreliable. This is a form of a self-defeating argument, because then anything within the human being which is delivered to us by by our cognitive system should be unreliable, which means our moral perceptions in some sense are wrong, which means that we believe that for example, murdering an innocent human being is wrong, is just an evolutionary byproduct in some sense. And you can be like beehives, or sharks who can uh, or lions who do infanticide and something like that, because they have actually developed this kind of evolutionary byproduct, and we have, so it makes all moral perceptions arbitrary in some sense. Not just that, but for example, some of the laws, law of non-contradiction, because it is the same as if that is also something which is just automatically delivered to us by our cognitive system, then the whole reasoning process in some sense is unreliable, which is also known as Darwin's doubt, or is also known as the evolutionary arguments against naturalism. And if a person is uh, trying to negate this spiritual instinct by saying that it is just an evolutionary byproduct and arbitrarily spin-off of evolution, then he has to also question his own reasoning. Anyways, this argument, all this argument, the evolutionary arguments against naturalism applies to them, but when they're admitting this makes the argument even stronger, because this would show in some sense insincerity on the part of the atheist, where his criticism is based on a shaky ground in some sense, because he's trying to criticize something using another thing which is also based on which also falls under the same category in some sense. So this argument, I think, when an atheist would use this argument, it would be a far more a bigger problem for him to explain other things and explain his own rational faculties, because then that would put into question many of the other things that they believe in human rights, they believe in this and this and that and this and that, and then they're very adamant about implementing some morals, and everything would be put into question. And some atheists, they admitted, like for example Richard Dawkins was asked, like is a grape as same as, for example, human beings grew 5 fingers and it could have been six, the our belief in, for example, grape being wrong. And he said, and then that was, like in some sense, admission on their part that, yes, they can't tackle these issues in some sense. So that can be one objection. Any objection you can think of regarding?
Well, if they want to say that the spiritual instinct, or what we call the Fitrah instincts, are just biologically hardwired from evolution, then from their paradigm, evolution still favors the theist. And we
Yeah,
know without any doubt that secular atheists are not having enough children to replace themselves.
exactly.
So evolution clearly favors the theists, because it doesn't even want you lot to reproduce, because theists are having more children, and Muslims in particular. So you got to ask
Exactly.
yourself, why does it favor Muslims? It makes absolutely no sense. And secondly, by what mechanism, and this is where the shirky aspects come into it, by what mechanism has, because these instincts are not learned, as even the secular psychologists and people who have studied the children and the natural theology have said, children don't have to learn these instincts. By what mechanism has evolution managed to hardwire this into the DNA of everybody, keep it there, even in the face of their parents, or one of their parents being non-religious, their society being non-religious, and allow it to express itself in the minds of children and stuff? Like, this cannot be done by a random process. This can only be done by something with control, awareness, knowledge, absolute ability. It's totally self-defeating when you think about it.
Right,
It's
right.
like, they will never be able to come to to explain this in totality, because it's not something that has to be learned. So,
Exactly. And I can reference some works which kind of also allude to the argument that, if the universe or is all there is, the belief in the mind, belief of God, something transcendent, shouldn't even arise in the mind. The fact that we have this belief, the fact that we have a belief to connect to the transcendent, and if there is nothing like the transcendent, then how does these kind of blind forces of nature make us even come to the conclusion that there is something like that and we need to connect to it? And I think there's one more a very good video by Justin Barrett again, and he mentions that, this is actually, if you evaluate, these two worldviews, like the atheistic worldview and the atheistic worldview, and you see, what, which worldview has more explanatory scope. And in terms of, the atheistic worldview, it is again a problem for the atheist to explain, even though if these are just arbitrary spin-offs of evolution, why are they the case? And within theism, it makes more sense that, if theism is true, then we would expect to have these kind of evidences,
yes,
and this is
obviously.
what we actually find. So then again, it is a problem to, problem to explain as to why does your worldview, which would not expect something like that, which is very unlikely in this worldview, turns out to have these kind of evidences. And theism explains it far better than atheism in some sense. So that is another point that can be made to this objection that is quite prevalent, I believe. Also, I believe that there's one very good argument from Asadullah Ali, and I'm going to reference that also, inshallah. If I start reading that, it's going to be too long. But what he's trying to say is that actually saying that it is just an arbitrary spin-off of evolution is just trying to push the problem one step back. It's not explaining. It's not an actual explanation. You're just trying to push it away or one step back. And okay, let me read it. Inshallah, it is going to be good. So the question about, so he says that, the question about God's existence should never begin with, is there evidence? The real question should be, how can humans believe in something that has no similarity to the reality we are supposed to experience? Theism shouldn't be possible in a reality which doesn't provide any reason for God. If the natural world is all there is, belief in the God should belief in God shouldn't even arise in the mind, much less have such a strong hold on the human psyche. Fairies, unicorns, and flying spaghettis are poor analogies which should showcase the ignorance of those skeptical of God's existence, because these are merely composite of naturally occurring things. They are rightly called myths because the features of the they possess are already experienced, yet their combinations are not. However, God is other to the universe, beyond our imagination, yet we strongly feel the need to ascribe design, intelligence, and power to all of existence itself, even if we outright deny it. Now, in some sense, this is another objection that atheists kind of can come up with, and it is kind of tackling that, for like, what about spaghettis and flying spaghetti monsters, etc, etc. And what they try to do is they do a category mistake. They take the basic belief in God and these kind of arbitrary concepts, and they say that what about these gods, etc, etc. But the point is that when we are arguing for God's existence, we are arguing the basic belief in an all powerful, all knowing creator, uh, which is universal, intuitive, natural, and untaught. Now, any flying spaghetti monster, any kind of belief like Odin or Thor or this god, or like giraffe god or zebra god, these are clearly human constructs, because we know that we are kind of using our imagination to combine two or three of our experiences. Take for example fairies. Fairies are just human beings, and we, for example, if see butterfly, we combine some of our experiences and create a concept or create something out of it. But when we talk about God, which is the transcendent, which is non-anthropomorphic, this begs the question: how can human beings come with this concept of non-anthropomorphic, where there is nothing within our experience or within our sensory perceptions that see something like that? So the fact that we come up with this belief naturally is a big question for the atheist. God being man-made makes no sense of this either, because there is nothing from which man can make God. Anthropomorphism aside, most conceptions of God go beyond this, negating similarity of man's own existence. But it is the perception itself that is miraculous in a world with no meaning, purpose, or transcendent source. The very existence of these instinctual clues bear witness to something greater than what atheists see the world as. These feelings, notions, and concepts are in fact real, pointing to something beyond ourselves. Not even the excuse of evolutionary adaptation can explain them away, for they merely push the problem one step back. No, God is as real as the reality we experience, because the reality we experience includes God in the equation. If truly an illusion, the burden of proof is on the atheist to undermine this natural inclination, not to pester theists with intellectually juvenile appeals to evidence which they don't even comprehend themselves. So I think this was brilliant by Asadullah Ali. I think he deserves a shout out with this. So so this is one objection that we deal with. Another objection, for example, an atheist might come up with, I think, which could be that like for example, our belief in that the earth is flat. For example, our initial impression or belief that the earth was flat was something like we thought of naturally or something like that. But then now we came to know that it's not the case that the earth is flat. So the first problem would be like in some sense differing between initial impression and intuition, and that is another topic. But for the sake of argument, even if we, for example, accept that as a thing, the problem would be that we stopped or we negated the belief of, for example, earth being flat only when we had enough evidence to disprove that. Now when it comes to God's existence, they have absolutely nothing to disprove God existence, and the fact is that that stays as a default. As I told earlier, in quoting Justin Barrett himself, he says that innocent until proven guilty and not guilty until proven innocent, because they are self-evident beliefs. So if there is no evidence as such yet, and of course they don't have any evidence, then the default position would always be to that there is a God in some sense. So again, this argument is also quite naive and not understanding what our position is. So this is also an objection that I don't think can actually be a self an undercutting defeater to what we are proposing. So I think the last point I would like to make is again related to this topic, which is a belief in God being the default position. Now this is something we, of course, we can we've always throughout the video we've argued that, and I think I would just touch a bit on it, which is that if we if we see all basic beliefs and anything that which is basic, anything that is a self-evident truth, they have some features which is like they are natural, they are intuitive, they are universal, they are untaught. These are the features or characteristics they have. And then we will see if this actually applies to God or not. So for example, we consider many beliefs to be self-evidently true. This means that the belief can be described as natural or true by default. Self-evident truths are characteristics by being universal, untaught, natural, and intuitive, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the like for example, the past existed at one point of time. So this is something natural, universal, intuitive, untaught. Or there are minds other than our own. This is something natural, intuitive, and untaught. Now, when it comes to God, belief in some type of being first of all being natural, belief in some type of a supernatural designer or cause is based on the natural functions of the human psyche. So it is natural, intuitive. The existence of a creator is the most intuitive interpretation of the world. It is the simplest and the most comprehensive explanation of the universe and our existence. It is also easy to understand without explicit instruction, which makes it intuitive also. And then I can elaborate more, but I know I'm just ending it, summating up, and then giving you the panel again. Universal, the basic underlying idea of a creator or a supernatural cause of the universe is cross cultural, as you mentioned, and this, I think this is what you are arguing for, and you always argue for. So which kind of makes it a even stronger case when we see cross cultural references of God everywhere, and you are giving more examples. It is not contingent on culture, but transcends it, like the belief in causality and the existence of other minds, as I mentioned earlier. Now, untaught, you do not require any information, whether from culture or education, to know a creator for things exist. This may be the reason why sociologists and anthropologists argue that even if atheist children were stranded on a desert island, they would come to a belief that something created the island. And of course, you also mentioned that the Greenlanders, for example, they were making design arguments, etc., which was quite fascinating. So again, we come back to what I was stating. The belief in a God, creator, designer, supernatural cause is a self-evident truth. It is universal, untaught, natural, intuitive. In this light, the right question to ask is not does God exist. The right question should be, why do you reject God's existence? This way, you will have turned the tables, and rightly so. Atheism is unnatural. The onus of proof is on someone who challenges a self-evident truth. When someone claims that the past is an illusion, or that other people do not have minds, he or she would have to shoulder the burden of proof. Atheists are no different. They have to justify rejection of a cause of a creator for the universe. So back to you, and anything you would like to add to that. And of course, I know you have more examples to give to make our case stronger.
Yeah, I won't add anything to what you said. It's pretty comprehensive, I believe, Khalid. I just got a couple more examples.
Yeah,
3, in fact, and then I think maybe we can finish up.
sure.
So let me just grab the notes. Okay, so the next 2 examples are referenced from Wilhelm Coppers, who I mentioned in the previous video. He's from the same school as Wilhelm Schmidt, who I also mentioned in the previous video. And the first example is from the Tierra del Fuegians, who are indigenous people from the very southern tip of South America. And these were people accused of having no religion whatsoever by Charles Darwin, amongst others.
Yeah.
Although he later did take this verdict back after certain evidences were presented to him. Now, Coppers himself spent a lot of time with this tribe, got to know them deeply, and himself and one other German guy were actually initiated into the tribe. They may have been the only white men ever to get initiated, and they didn't only overturn the accusation that they were godless, they overturned the accusation that they were basically savages as well. So his reference for this is a piece which was called Narrative of the Surveying Voyage of the Ships Adventure and Beagle between the years 1826 to 1836, which is describing sea expeditions of British ships which are going around the world, and they spent quite a bit of time there in South Africa. On one of the ships, there was a man called Captain Fitzroy, and he was on expedition to the Tierra del Fuego, the area where they are from. And he ended up taking 3 young Yamana on board. That's the name of one of their tribes, the Yamana. He wished to set them ashore after a time of having them on board, but they point blank refused and said they were in fear for their lives, did not want to be taken ashore. So Captain Fitzroy kept them on his ship and brought them back to London in 1830. They remained there until 1832. Now, in between time, they were examined, interrogated, you could say, as to their way of life, their culture, their beliefs, etc., by a psychologist in London. Wilhelm Coppers actually read the report himself. He said the report makes it very, very clear that the examination wasn't something shallow, like it was a very thorough examination. And regarding their religious characteristics, in 2 cases it was noted very strong belief in a supreme being, and this belief was also found to exist in the 3rd child or youngster, but it was less strongly marked. However, he was 28 and the other 2 being 10 and 14. So these native South Americans were found to have strong belief in a supreme being at the age of 10 and 14, and it's still a
Wow.
belief in a supreme being at the age of 28, but it was less pronounced. Coppers also, on their return voyage in 1832, Charles Darwin was actually on that voyage. And that was his first exposure to
Wow.
these Tierra del Fuegians. So him and others actually classified them as godless, atheists, and religious,
Wow.
without a
And I
religion.
think
Yeah, go
he
on.
also made a case, like, that they were savages or something, right? Like,
Yes, yeah, I'm going to come to that as well.
which is also refuted, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
please.
they had actually been examined in London, and the reports of them believing in a supreme being were lodged and documented there while they were on the boat back over with Charles Darwin. But because, again, like I mentioned in the first video, many of the explorers, they went with preconceived bias. They didn't take the time out to befriend the tribe, gain their trust, learn their language and whatnot. So Darwin, while actually being on a boat with the youngsters who were reported to believe in a supreme being, actually came back and labeled these people as godless. And they were also called barbarians and accused of cannibalism and all sorts of other stuff. But I don't have time to do it now. But if you actually read about Wilhelm Copper's initiation into the tribes, they actually passed down quite lofty moral codes during the initiation as well. That would be admirable amongst anyone. So he overturned the accusations of godlessness, atheism, barbarism, etc. But he then posits why he felt that people were so quick to absorb these accusations without like looking for counter evidence and stuff. He says because it simply did not fit with the materialistic conceptions of evolution and the evolutionist history of religion, which were being pushed at the end of the 19th century, meaning they heard what they wanted to hear and just swallowed it and promoted it, even though there were evidences to the contrary here and there. So yeah, maybe it's. I think it's worth going into this tribe in a lot more detail actually in a future video. Inshallah.
Inshallah.
We haven't got much time for it now. And Copper's second reference is regarding a tribe from the northeast of India. They are called the Munda, Munda. They are non-Aryan. Now,
Okay.
the significance of that, you will have to go back and watch the previous video for if you
Yeah.
haven't. So these people were also accused of being atheist at one stage, but Coppers shows clearly they do have belief in a high God. Now, these people were not on the primitive level of culture, they were on the next level up, the primary level. Coppers says because they show the signs of cultural development that takes them out of the primitive level and onto the primary level, which is basically where different types of shirk get inserted and mixed with the belief in one God. So they did have a belief in a high God, but the high God was drawn into general mythology and actually given a wife, which is what happens on the primary level
Exactly.
quite regularly. But he says the existence of a supreme being is beyond question. And in 1874, a Protestant missionary called Theodore Jellinghouse says a relatively clear belief in God is to be found among this tribe. But interestingly enough, this missionary himself admits that he arrived there with the bias that they were absolute heathens and could not possibly know anything about God. So I quote from him now. How great was my astonishment when I began to study the Munda Kal language with the legends and proverbs of this people. I soon discovered their fundamental conception of life was quite monotheistic, that the existence of one good God was in fact as naturally assumed as it is with believing Europeans. Later, I came to see more and more clearly that all of these heathens know of the existence of one God. So again, he's saying that the belief in God is very fitry among them, and it's simply naturally assumed, doesn't have to be deduced or learned. And Coppers then brings another reference. This one is quite funny, actually. It's a bit humorous. Uh, it's from another German missionary called Father Joseph Hoffmann, and he spent 37 years amongst the Munda and wrote a 15-volume encyclopedia on their culture and ways, you know. And he actually he's telling them here now that people in Europe used to believe that they were godless and atheistic, you know. So he relates, one day I said to a number of men, now listen, and I will tell you what the learned Europeans think about you. And I translated for them part of an English text expressing the opinions I have quoted concerning their supposed lack of belief in God and immortality, meaning a soul or a future life. One of my listeners interrupted me with the question, Father, which ass wrote that book? And when I answered that the author was no ass but a learned man, he replied, if he is a learned man, then how can he write such rubbish? Surely there are no human beings that do not know
Wow.
there is a God.
Wow.
So for him,
Wow.
it wasn't just naturally assumed that him and his people believed in God. He simply just thought everyone believes in God, you know, because he actually insulted the
Wow.
Europeans who had labeled them as godless and called them an ass, you know, which is
Wow.
quite
Wow.
funny.
Very
You know?
interesting.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You know, so again, like you can multiply quotes like that from around the world and stuff, but I don't think there's any need to as such. And I'd just like to finish up on a report about the Maoris, who are the natives of New Zealand, obviously. And this is kind of more of it's more related to original monotheism than it is to Fitrah references, but there's some very interesting aspects of it as well. So the reference here is from an ethnographer called Elsden Best. He's from New Zealand himself, and very important ethnographer of the Maoris, and he wrote many different pieces about them, their culture in general, but not just their religion. He highlights that early missionaries, also they didn't say these people were atheistic or had no religion, but early missionaries, they did deny that they had a belief in a supreme being. And now this is kind of understandable because Best, and he highlights from himself and others how the knowledge of the supreme being, Eo, was restricted to the priestly class. So it would have been a bit harder to discover with these people, but he does go in on them a bit for not recognizing it. So they were originally accused of having no belief in the supreme being. Then, when belief in the supreme being, and I'll bring forth the attributes of their supreme being last, but when belief in the supreme being was discovered, highlighted, and works were published, as I said in the previous video, Wilhelm Schmidt and others, when they brought this forward, some people tried to discredit it and say, no, this is actually from Christian influence, cross-cultural influences. But I show how
Okay.
that's ridiculous in the previous video, and Elsden Best shows how it's ridiculous here as well, because he says, like, there's not a hint of scriptural mention, meaning the Bible, in their beliefs. And their beliefs don't correlate with Christianity whatsoever. So he goes in quite hard on that accusation as well. Now, this guy didn't believe in original monotheism himself, but he did clearly say their belief in the supreme being is impossible to trace to ancestor worship and impossible to trace to animism. So he's actually ruling out everything, almost everything other than
Wow, wow.
being
This is very interesting.
the remnants of revelation. And he says something here which I would agree with in part, but he said that this concept of a supreme being they had was done through like philosophical back and forth between the intelligentsia or the priestly class amongst them. But he said it must have been formed before the Maori ended up where they are now in New Zealand and split into different clans. Now, we would agree, yes, that the remnants of original monotheism are more easily found before people break up and split into different clans, but obviously we disagree that it's the result of a philosophical exercise, so to speak. We believe it's what's left from the trace of the river of whenever they last had a prophet or a messenger come to their people, you know. So, yes, he also backs up what he says by people who are fellow experts in the Maori language. And even their natives themselves say that their most ancient prayers were addressed to Io, to the supreme God only. And yeah, they had no images of Io, and they didn't believe in incarnations or anything like this. And then Best goes to list some of his attributes. They say Io is the core of all the gods. None excel him. He is greater than all the gods. One attribute is Io Roa, which means his life is everlasting. He does not die. Another attribute is Io the parent. He is the parent of the heavens and of all the different realms, of all the worlds, clouds, insects, birds, rats, fish, moons, stars, lightning, winds, waters, trees, plant life, the land, the sea, the streams, and everything else. There is no single thing that does not come under his control. He is the parent of all things, of mankind and the lesser gods under him. He is truly the parent of all. Another name signifies Io the parentless. He has no parents, no mother, no elder or younger brothers or sisters. He is nothing but himself. Io Take Take, which denotes his permanence and the permanence of all his acts, his thoughts, and his government. All are enduring, firm, complete, and immovable. Io Te Pukenga, which means he is the source of all thought, reflection, and memories, of all things planned by him to possess form, growth, life, and strength. Nothing is outside his jurisdiction. All things are his, and with him alone rests the matter of possession or non-possession. Io Te Wanaga, which means he is the source of all knowledge, whether that pertains to life or death, evil or good, to dissension or lack of dissension, to peacemaking or failure to make peace. None of this is outside his influence. Io, the crown of heaven, he is the God of the uppermost of all the heavens. There is no heaven beyond that one which is known to him. Io, the many-eyed, meaning no place is hidden from his eyes and thoughts, whether in the heavens or the various realms, the world, the waters, or the depths of the beds of the rivers or the clouds. All things are gathered together in his eyes. They have one name that means Io, the hidden face, which is meant to mean that he is unseen. And another name, which is Io Matawe, which means attributes compassion and being loving to the Maori supreme god. So Elsden Best actually wrote a lot on those points that I just mentioned, but for brevity, can't really go in too deep on them. But I thought it'd be interesting to finish there, you know.
Subhanallah. So I think there were many important things that were mentioned, like saying that he's the creator of the sun, stars, skies, universe, everything. I think again that this is also very fitri concept, as I mentioned. Like we human beings are predisposed. Like just looking at nature, it makes us feel that yes, there is a creator. This is the part of the fitra. So like, what do you have anything like in terms of concluding the discussion? Uh, so far what have we covered, like maybe try to sum it up in alhamdulillah, I think we've covered a lot, much more than I expected. And we covered it, how like the fitra is cross cultural, it is universal, intuitive, it is natural, and there are so many aspects of the fitra, even though we did target God's existence and in some sense monotheism a little bit more than all the other aspects. But still, if we see, if we go back, if in terms of you using all these evidence of, for example, primitive type tribe or these kind of old cultures, and which kind of very much coincides with whatever we have contemporary in academia, which kind of dictates what kind of natural positions we human beings have. So I think there's a lot to take for our audiences from this. Anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think the concept of the fitrah in Islam is like very simple, Khalid, very easy to understand. And using Occam's razor, if like these concepts are embedded in the mind and the emotions and the will of mankind the whole world over, and have been throughout history, like the most simple explanation is that God has something to do with embedding the knowledge of himself within mankind, and if there is a God, obviously there's no if for us, but from the atheist or the agnostic point of view, then the being that can create universes easily is also capable of communicating with us, whether via revelation, which we obviously also believe in, and also intuition and implanting embedded knowledge of him and his attributes and the willingness to connect with him and seek him within us. It's actually the simplest explanation for all these things, because otherwise you're just going to dance around and jump through hoops to try and find an explanation. And if even
Exactly.
the secular atheist psychologists and people who study the natural theology are coming to these conclusions, you've got to ask yourself why it's there. If it's not God, then why is it there? How is it there? How has it persisted? How is it spontaneous, and so on and so forth. That's how I finish.
Exactly. So maybe for a concluding remark, what I would actually just state something, which is, imagine a person comes to me or comes to you or anyone else and says that the real world is not real. We might think this is something so bizarre, and we would,
Mm,
even though there is so much of evidence, and we can provide that, and you can even brush that away. But the point is, we don't need evidence for that.
mm,
And so the same way, an atheist is just like a solipsist. A solipsist is the one who believes that the real world is not real. If you compare both of them, there is not much difference between both of them, even though we might consider a solipsist to be someone who's who's lost it in some sense. But then the reality skeptic and the God skeptic are really no different from an epistemological point of view. Therefore, we would argue that rejecting God's existence is equivalent to rejecting the world is that the world is real, because they are both self-evident truth. Well, they are both self-evident truths. So I believe that was a bit longer, but to conclude, I think we have put forth many ways how we can establish God's existence without rational evidence. Even though, inshallah, I'm going to have videos of for rational evidence also. And then, mashallah, you've also refuted many of the many of the objections that people put forth, that these societies were atheistic or that societies were atheistic. But when as you mentioned, when people go dig deeper, they understand that no, they have these beliefs,
mm,
they believe in the supernatural, they have something transcendent, they want to connect with the transcendent, even though it is mixed up with shirk, it is not in line completely, but there is something beliefs in the supernatural. It's there, it's quite evident. So I believe that is enough to conclude. And too much on, I think I was targeting atheism too much, but I think this is not enough. Inshallah, I'll have more videos on it,
inshallah.
uh, inshallah. but we but I think to the point that adding so many evidences for God's existence being self-evidently true, I think in some sense it would be undeniable in some sense, now that if our viewers are watching and have gone through this entire stream. I think they should ponder on what we have put forth and reflect more on it, inshallah ta'ala. So I think that is enough, that is all that I had to conclude. And I'm really thankful that you came back to our channel and provided with so many gems, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
So yeah, coming back to you.
Yeah, so like you said, Khalid, a number of tribes were actually said to be without religion or godless throughout the centuries, I suppose, since atheism started to get a hold and stuff. Every single accusation has been overturned, and
Wow.
overturned quite easily. Now, there is one modern accusation of atheism, which is leveled at a tribe called the Piraha in Brazil. And this is because there is an ex-Christian guy that went there and apparently became atheist after staying with this tribe. And he tries to market them as the most ultra-rational, materialistic tribe. And I forget his name. I do have the references somewhere, but this accusation of them being atheists has also been overturned. There are Latin anthropologists who have researched them more thoroughly, at least, and probably more honestly than this guy. And some of them have actually said that his research with them was just like an excuse or a poster for atheism, but they've actually uncovered that they do have a creation story, quite a simple, naive one. But anyway,
Wow.
there is a creator there involved, and they have like a really basic end of times, like apocryphal story as well, involving the same demiurge or creator. So this Piraha tribe, people try and use it quite regularly these days. They have shown to not be godless or atheist at all. And
Wow.
even if they were, which they're not, even if they were, it's like less than a minute exception.
Yeah.
If you take all the civilizations and tribal cultures that have existed throughout history, because the exception never affects the rule in anything,
Yeah.
but they don't even reach the level of exception because more honest researchers have uncovered their creation story and their end of times destruction story, if you like, as well. So no one can come in and now say, what about the Piraha, but I'll have to get the
Subhanallah.
references back for it.
Subhanallah.
That
Subhanallah.
refutation is there. Yeah.
And also I believe that if for example we have any atheistic civilization also, if we come across any, inshallah, I have confidence that if we look back into their culture, and if we go back, and if we are able to go back, we would find some or the other evidence where it leads to the supernatural in some sense, or they have this concept of a creation, or they have this concept of God. And this is something which is quite consistently seen. And it would be the same with any other tribe that we come across. So
Yeah, I
again,
mean, like even most people these days, if you want to take the most broad meaning of atheism, which includes agnosticism, and most people are not actually hard atheists. In fact, that they absolutely deny God's existence. Most people fall under the spectrum of not being sure whether they lean one way or the other. And even these people, as Paul Williams has shown on his channel and others, according to studies, many of them do believe in at least something supernatural as well. So,
exactly,
like
exactly,
point blank, stone cold atheism is like a really rare thing. It's not nowhere
exactly.
near as prevalent as they would like to have you believe.
Exactly. And then, sorry to, if just one thing to add to that,
Yeah, of course.
which is very interesting, which is there was one video for Richard Dawkins, who's one of the most prominent atheists, who's the role model of naturalist. And he in some sense had a discussion with Brian Greene, who's I think a physicist, and he's agnostic. Brian Greene is agnostic. So Brian Greene was explaining him about his story, and maybe that is something longer. That actually dictates to how in a dangerous situation, how we kind of incline toward the supernatural. But then he asked Richard Dawkins, if you have how do you have any kind of he in his terms, any irrational beliefs like this? And then he said that he admitted, and he said that sometimes I have this problem of not being able to sleep in haunted houses. And then and then this was quite funny, the biggest idol for naturalists, one of the biggest idol for
Mm.
naturalists himself, has a problem in sleeping places which are kind of
Yeah.
are kind of popular for being haunted in some sense. So again, there are some things which even though you don't want to believe in the supernatural, but then you cannot get rid of it completely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Being an absolute naturalist is next to impossible. And then
Mm.
there's work on that also. But I think that would be enough for today. Just one thing to add, which is a very interesting quote from Graham Lawton, a columnist. He's a columnist at New Scientist. He says that to be an actual atheist and reject all religious ideas is not humanly possible. We'll still fill the hole with something, which is quite interesting.
Mm.
So atheists, they do try to connect, have something which they think is transcendent. Sometimes they try to have these kind of, like, for example, these atheism having these atheist abiding by something, like, like, for example, liberalism itself, or for example, for wokeism, or take, for example, veganism, or these kind of ideas. They want something beyond themselves. They want some meaning to their lives, and that is why they connect to these things. But that is not the right thing to connect, and I would argue that, maybe they need to look into Islam, and maybe they would find what they're looking for, inshallah. So I think that's it for today. And Jazakallah khairan for coming. I think we've covered a lot, much more than I expected, and I think there's a lot to put forth. Alhamdulillah. Maybe our audiences can comment if they want you back again. They would like to see you back again for any other interesting topic like this. Please comment on the channel, and then inshallah we will try getting Gerry back to our channel. Jazakallah khairan, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Looking forward to see you again, inshallah.
Inshallah. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.